Brandon Cole's world was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly scared. The pulsating music from the party seemed to mock him, each beat pounding in his chest like a reminder of everything he had to lose. Crystal glasses clinked around him, filled with champagne, while laughter and shallow conversation buzzed in the background. But he couldn't focus on any of it. His hands, trembling slightly, gripped the edge of the marble bar. He had just checked his phone again, 6 missed calls from his father. Something is wrong. Really wrong. In the middle of the most extravagant suite of one of his family's luxury hotels, Brandon felt more alone than ever. His circle of friends, the people who were supposed to have his back, were scattered around the room, too busy chasing their next high to notice the storm brewing in his head. But it wasn't their fault. They had no reason to care. Why would they? To them, Brandon was just the heir to the Cole empire, a guy with more money than he could spend, no real problems, and no reason to ever stop partying. That's who he had become. That's what they saw. But now, staring at his phone, Brandon felt like he was on the edge of something he couldn't walk back from. The thought made his stomach churn. Why is Dad calling so much? His father wasn't the type to check in, not unless something was seriously off. The thought sent a chill through him, cutting through the haze of alcohol and flashing lights. Suddenly, the phone buzzed again, its vibration rattling against the bar. Charles Cole. Brandon hesitated for a second before picking up the call. As he pressed the phone to his ear, the noise from the party faded into the background, and for a brief moment, all he could hear was the faint, unsteady sound of his own breath. "Brandon," came his father's voice, cold and sharp, cutting straight to the point. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Brandon's heart sank. He knew that tone too well. It was the voice Charles Cole reserved for moments of absolute disappointment, the kind that made Brandon feel like a child, even now, at 28 years old. He opened his mouth to respond, to offer some kind of explanation, but before he could speak, his father's words came crashing through the line. "You've humiliated the family. Your antics at the international convention this week have cost us more than you can imagine." The words hit him like a physical blow, each sentence twisting tighter in his gut. "Do you know how many deals we lost because of you?" Brandon's mind raced, trying to make sense of what his father was saying. The convention. Right. He had flown out to Tokyo for the International Hospitality Summit, a crucial event where his family's business was supposed to secure multi-million-dollar deals with partners from around the world. But instead of focusing on the meetings and negotiations, Brandon had partied hard. He'd barely even attended the conference, skipping meetings to indulge in lavish after-parties with other wealthy heirs and socialites. And now, apparently, it had all caught up with him. I didn't think it would," Brandon stammered, but his father cut him off with a voice that had grown even colder, more distant. "You didn't think. That's exactly the problem, Brandon. You've never thought about anything but yourself." There was a pause, long enough for Brandon to hear the bitterness in his father's next words. "I've been cleaning up your mess for years, but this is too far." The silence that followed was suffocating. Brandon's throat tightened, the weight of his father's disappointment pressing down on him like a vice. For a brief moment, he thought about hanging up, running away from the conversation like he had run from so many responsibilities in his life. But he couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. Charles Cole's voice broke through again, colder than before. "You've left me no choice, Brandon. If you want to stay in this family, you're going to fix this. And you're going to start by marrying Emma Reed." Brandon blinked, the name jarring him out of his fog. Wait, what? He hadn't heard the name Emma Reed in years. She was a manager at one of the smaller hotels in the chain, barely on his radar. Why would his father bring her up now? "You heard me," his father snapped. "You're going to marry her, and you're going to do it fast. The Reed family has been loyal to us for decades. Emma is hardworking, disciplined, everything you're not. Maybe being around someone like her will straighten you out. And maybe, just maybe, it'll be enough to start repairing the damage you've done." Brandon felt like he had been punched in the gut. Marry Emma Reed? A woman he barely knew? It sounded absurd. "Dad, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm deadly serious, Brandon." His father's voice was colder than ever. "If you don't marry her, you're out. No inheritance. No stake in the company. Nothing." For a moment, Brandon couldn't speak. The enormity of what his father was saying hung in the air between them, and for the first time in his life, he realized just how fragile his position was. He had always thought he was untouchable, that his last name would protect him no matter how many mistakes he made. But now it was all slipping away. "I expect you to make a decision by tomorrow," his father added, his tone final. "Don't make me regret giving you this last chance." The line went dead, leaving Brandon standing alone on the balcony, his phone still in his hand. The cool night air hit his face, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside him. His mind raced with panic and confusion. A forced marriage to save his inheritance? Was this really happening? He stared down at the city lights below, feeling for the first time in years like his world was completely out of control. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a sickening sense of dread. Emma Reed. The name echoed in his mind, taunting him. A woman he barely knew, now tied to his future in ways he couldn't have imagined. And for what? To clean up the mess he had made of his life? Brandon clenched his fists, a wave of anger surging through him. But beneath the anger, there was something else, something darker and more terrifying. Fear. Fear that maybe his father was right. Fear that maybe, after all these years of coasting through life, he had finally gone too far. The air in the small conference room was thick with tension. Brandon sat slumped in his chair, eyes darting between the documents spread out on the table. Across from him sat Emma Reed, her posture rigid, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes betrayed a storm of emotions. Brandon could feel the resentment rolling off her in waves, matching his own growing frustration. This wasn't how he'd imagined his life. A marriage arranged not out of love, not even out of convenience, but out of necessity, a desperate move to salvage his crumbling reputation and secure his place in the coal empire. And Emma, the quiet, disciplined manager of one of their lesser hotels, had become the key to his future. It felt absurd, like some twisted joke, but there was no backing out now. The ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry. "I don't know why you agreed to this," Brandon muttered, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was bitter, laced with the resentment he felt toward the entire situation. Emma's gaze flicked toward him, her expression unreadable. "Because I had no choice." Her words were calm, but they cut deep. Brandon felt a surge of defensiveness rise in his chest, but before he could retort, Emma continued. "I need the money for my father's medical bills, and you need to clean up your image." Her tone was matter-of-fact, cold even. There was no trace of warmth, no attempt at comfort. This wasn't a partnership, it was a transaction. The truth of her statement stung more than it should have. Brandon had spent his entire life skating by on charm, wealth, and the protection of his family's name. He had never had to work for anything, never had to make real sacrifices. And now, faced with the reality of his situation, he found himself cornered, with no way out but through Emma. "I guess that makes two of us, then," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Emma's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer before she turned her attention back to the documents. She flipped through the pages with a quiet efficiency, as though this was just another business meeting, another routine obligation to check off her list. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Brandon wanted to say something, anything, that would break the tension between them, but the words wouldn't come. What was there to say? He had no interest in pretending this marriage was anything more than what it was, a cold, calculated move to protect both of their futures. Still, something about Emma's calm demeanor unnerved him. She wasn't like the women he usually surrounded himself with, beautiful, carefree socialites who laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word. No, Emma was different. She was quiet, serious, and utterly unimpressed by his wealth and status. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. The days that followed were filled with awkward silences and tense conversations. Brandon avoided spending time at home, preferring to drown his frustrations in late-night parties and mindless distractions. But no matter how many drinks he had, no matter how many meaningless conversations he engaged in, the reality of his situation weighed on him like a stone around his neck. Meanwhile, Emma threw herself into her work. She was determined to keep her distance from Brandon, focusing instead on managing her hotel and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But the stress of her father's illness, combined with the new pressures of being thrust into the public eye as Brandon Cole's wife, was beginning to take its toll. It wasn't long before the first cracks in their fragile arrangement began to show. One evening, after yet another long day at the office, Brandon returned home to find Emma waiting for him in the living room. She was seated on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but there was a tension in her posture that immediately put him on edge. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Brandon groaned inwardly. He was in no mood for a serious conversation. His head was pounding from the aftereffects of the previous night's party, and all he wanted was to retreat to his room and forget about everything. But the look in Emma's eyes told him there was no escaping this. "About what?" he asked, sinking into an armchair across from her. "About this," she gestured between them. "This situation." Brandon frowned, already on the defensive. "What about it? We agreed to this, didn't we?" "Yes, we agreed," Emma said, her voice level. "But you've been avoiding me, avoiding everything. This marriage isn't just about us anymore. Your father made that clear when he pushed us into it. The board is watching, the media is watching, and we can't afford any more screw-ups." Brandon bristled at her words. He knew she was right, but hearing it out loud made his stomach churn with anger and guilt. "So what do you want me to do, huh? Play the perfect husband? Show up at charity events with a fake smile and pretend like everything's fine?" Emma didn't flinch at his sarcasm. "Yes," she said simply. "That's exactly what I want. Because if you don't, we both lose everything." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Brandon didn't know how to respond. He wanted to argue, to push back against the cold logic of her reasoning, but deep down, he knew she was right. His father's ultimatum had left him with no choice. Either he played the part of the dutiful husband, or he risked losing everything he'd ever known. "Fine," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. "I'll play along. But don't expect me to like it." As the weeks passed, their public appearances became a well-orchestrated performance. They attended charity galas, business luncheons, and media events together, always smiling for the cameras, always presenting the image of a united, happy couple. But behind closed doors, the tension between them simmered, unspoken and unresolved. For Emma, the pressure was overwhelming. Not only did she have to manage her hotel and care for her father, but now she had to navigate the treacherous waters of high society, where every misstep could lead to scandal. She had never been one for the spotlight, and the constant scrutiny made her feel like she was drowning. Brandon, on the other hand, was beginning to crack under the weight of expectations. He was tired of pretending, tired of living a lie. The resentment he felt toward his father, toward Emma, and even toward himself was building to a breaking point. And it wasn't long before that resentment found a target. One afternoon, while Brandon was reviewing the financial reports for one of the company's struggling hotels, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Simon Green, his father's right-hand man, stepping into the office. Simon was a tall, thin man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. He had been with the Cole family for decades, overseeing the business with a ruthless efficiency that had earned him both respect and fear. Brandon had never liked him. "We need to talk," Simon said without preamble, his voice as cold as the man himself. Brandon set down the report, already dreading the conversation. "What now?" Simon closed the door behind him and crossed the room, standing in front of Brandon's desk. "I've been reviewing the numbers," he said, his tone clipped. "And it seems we have a serious problem with the Westbury property." Brandon frowned. The Westbury Hotel had been a point of contention for months. Located in a once thriving area, the property had seen a steady decline in business, and the financial reports showed it. "I'm aware of the issues," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're working on a solution." Simon's eyes narrowed. "You're working on it? That's not good enough. This hotel is bleeding money, and if we don't turn it around soon, it's going to drag the entire company down with it." The weight of Simon's words settled heavily on Brandon's shoulders. He knew the stakes were high, but hearing it from Simon made it feel all the more real. This wasn't just about his reputation anymore, this was about the future of the coal empire. "I understand," Brandon said, his voice strained. "I'll take care of it." But Simon wasn't convinced. "Will you?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're more interested in playing house with your new wife than running this company." The accusation hit Brandon like a slap to the face. His hands clenched into fists under the desk, anger surging through him. "I'm doing everything I can," he snapped. "This marriage isn't." "Isn't what?" Simon interrupted, his voice cutting through Brandon's protest. "Isn't real? Isn't what you wanted?" Newsflash, Brandon, none of this is about what you want. It's about what's best for the company. And right now, what's best is for you to get your act together before we lose everything. Brandon stared at Simon, his heart pounding in his chest. He hated the man, hated the way he talked down to him, hated the way he always seemed to be one step ahead. But more than anything, he hated the fact that Simon was right. If the Westbury property failed, it wouldn't just be his reputation on the line. It would be the entire business. His father's legacy. The one thing he had always taken for granted. Without another word, Simon turned and left the office, leaving Brandon alone with his thoughts. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. He was in over his head, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix it. The tension between Brandon and Emma had been building for weeks. They had fallen into a rhythm, cold, calculated, and devoid of emotion, moving through their days with the precision of business partners, not spouses. In public, they played their roles flawlessly, attending events, meetings, and galas, presenting the perfect image for the media. Behind closed doors, they barely spoke, only discussing the essentials of their marriage arrangement and the impending financial disaster looming over the Westbury Hotel. But beneath the surface, both of them were unraveling. Brandon, despite his best efforts, had begun to feel the crushing weight of responsibility bearing down on him. The Westbury property, once a jewel in the family's portfolio, was on the brink of collapse, and every attempt he made to salvage it seemed to push it closer to the edge. His father's cold reprimands and Simon Green's veiled threats only added to the pressure. Every day, he was reminded of the stakes. If Westbury fell, so would he. And it wasn't just his inheritance at risk anymore, it was his identity, his pride, everything he had ever known. For Emma, the situation was just as dire. Her father's health was deteriorating faster than the doctors had predicted, and the medical bills were piling up. She had hoped that marrying Brandon would secure her father's future, but now, with the Westbury crisis threatening to sink the entire company, even that hope was slipping through her fingers. Her own hotel was stable, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on her, that no matter how hard she worked, she would never be able to escape the shadow of the Cole family and the weight of their expectations. The breaking point came on a cold, rainy evening. Brandon had spent the day at the Westbury property, going over the latest financial reports and trying to formulate a last-ditch plan to turn things around. Emma, meanwhile, had been dealing with yet another crisis at her own hotel. One of the senior staff members had abruptly resigned, leaving a gaping hole in their operations. Exhausted and frustrated, they both returned to their penthouse apartment, neither of them in the mood for conversation. But this time, the silence between them was different. It wasn't just tense, it was charged with something unspoken, something neither of them had acknowledged until now. Brandon threw his jacket onto the couch and poured himself a drink, ignoring the way Emma's eyes followed him from across the room. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" Emma finally asked, her voice tight. Brandon didn't look at her. He took a long sip of his whiskey, feeling the burn in his throat, and then set the glass down on the bar with a sharp clink. "What do you mean?" Emma crossed her arms, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "You've been avoiding me for weeks, Brandon. Something is wrong. I know the Westbury situation is bad, but there's more to it than that, isn't there?" Brandon stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. He didn't want to talk about it. Not with her. Not with anyone. But the truth was gnawing at him, eating away at his resolve. He couldn't keep pretending everything was under control. The Westbury Hotel, he hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It's worse than we thought. I don't think we're going to be able to save it." Emma's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. She had suspected as much, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. If the Westbury Hotel went under, the ripple effects would be devastating for both of them. "I've tried everything," Brandon continued, his voice hollow. "But nothing's working. The investors are pulling out, the staff is panicking, and now Simon's breathing down my neck, telling me it's my responsibility to fix it. But I can't. I don't know how to fix it." For the first time since their marriage, Brandon let his vulnerability show. He wasn't the carefree, reckless playboy she had married out of necessity. He was a man on the verge of losing everything, and it terrified him. Emma's heart softened, just for a moment. She could see the weight of his fear, the cracks in his facade. But she also knew that fear wasn't enough. Fear wouldn't save the Westbury Hotel, and it wouldn't save them. "There has to be a way," she said quietly. "We can't give up." Brandon shook his head, his expression bleak. "There's nothing more we can do. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe." But then, the unexpected twist came, a phone call that would change everything. It was late at night when the call came through. Brandon was in his office, staring blankly at the financial reports, when his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, frowning when he saw the name. Mark Sullivan, the CEO of a rival luxury hotel chain, hadn't spoken to Brandon in months, not since the last time they'd run into each other at an industry event, where they had exchanged icy pleasantries. Why was he calling now? Brandon hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen before he finally answered. "Mark? This is unexpected." "Brandon," Mark's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something predatory. "I hear you're having some trouble with Westbury." Brandon's grip on the phone tightened. Of course, word had gotten out. The industry was small, and rumors spread like wildfire. "What do you want?" "I want to help," Mark said smoothly. "Let's not beat around the bush. We both know your father's empire is on shaky ground. Westbury is going to collapse, and when it does, it's going to take a lot of your family's reputation with it. But it doesn't have to be that way." Brandon frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about a deal," Mark replied, his tone dripping with false generosity. "I buy Westbury from you, at a fair price. You offload the liability, save face, and walk away with something to show for it. It's a win-win." Brandon's heart raced. This was it, the lifeline he had been waiting for. A way out of the mess. But something about Mark's tone, the slickness of his offer, made Brandon pause. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than Mark was letting on. "What's the catch?" Brandon asked, his voice low. No catch, Mark said, too quickly. Just a straightforward business deal. You sell, I buy, and you walk away with your head held high. But Brandon knew better. He had grown up in the world of corporate sharks, and Mark Sullivan was one of the biggest. There was always a catch. I'll need to think about it, Brandon said, his mind racing. Mark's laugh was short and cold. Don't think too long, Brandon. Deals like this don't stay on the table forever. You know how this game works. Brandon hung up, his hands shaking. He couldn't tell if this was the opportunity he'd been hoping for, or if it was a trap. But one thing was clear, the stakes had just been raised. The next morning, Brandon sat across from Emma at the breakfast table, the tension between them thick as ever. He hadn't told her about the call from Mark yet, unsure of how to broach the subject. But as he watched her sip her coffee, her brow furrowed in thought, he knew he couldn't keep it from her any longer. I got a call last night, he said, his voice flat. From Mark Sullivan. Emma's eyes snapped to his, suspicion flashing across her face. What did he want? He offered to buy Westbury. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma set her cup down slowly, her gaze never leaving Brandon's face. And you're considering it? I don't know, Brandon admitted. It could solve our problems. If we sell, we offload the liability and save the rest of the company. But at what cost? Emma asked, her voice tight. You know what this will do to your family's reputation. Selling Westbury to Mark Sullivan is like handing him the keys to the kingdom. He'll use it to undermine everything your father built. Brandon ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. I don't have a choice, Emma. I'm out of options. If we don't do something soon, Westbury is going to collapse, and when it does, it's going to drag the entire company down with it. Emma stood up, her expression fierce. There has to be another way. We can't let Mark Sullivan win. You know he's not doing this to help you. He's doing it to destroy you. Brandon knew she was right, but the pressure was unbearable. His father was already losing faith in him, and the board was growing restless. Simon Green had made it clear that if Brandon didn't fix the Westbury crisis soon, there would be consequences that could cost him everything. But then, just as he was about to respond, another bombshell dropped. Brandon, there's something you need to know, Emma said, her voice hesitant now. She took a deep breath, as if bracing herself for what she was about to reveal. There's more going on here than you realize. Brandon frowned, his heart skipping a beat. What are you talking about? Emma bit her lip, clearly struggling with how to explain. It's Simon, she finally said. He's been working behind the scenes to sabotage Westbury. Brandon stared at her, stunned. What? I found some documents, Emma continued, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. Financial reports that don't add up. Simon's been funneling money out of the company, and he's been using Westbury as a scapegoat. He wants it to fail. Brandon's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into place. The unexplained financial losses, the constant pressure from Simon, the feeling that something was off. It all made sense now. Simon had been playing him from the start, pushing him toward failure while pretending to help. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been so focused on saving Westbury that he hadn't seen the real threat right in front of him. And now, with Mark Sullivan circling like a vulture, ready to swoop in and pick the bones of the coal empire, Brandon realized that the game was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Brandon Cole sat in the quiet darkness of his office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. The glow of his computer screen was the only light in the room, casting sharp shadows on his face. The revelations from Emma still echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. Simon Green was betraying him, sabotaging the company from within, and Brandon hadn't seen it. He had been too consumed by the chaos of his own failures, too distracted by the pressure of living up to his father's expectations, to notice the rot festering under his nose. His hands trembled as he picked up the papers again. The evidence was undeniable. Emma had found hidden financial records showing Simon's illicit activities, transferring funds through shadow companies, manipulating numbers to make it look like Westbury was hemorrhaging more money than it actually was. Simon had been carefully setting Brandon up for failure, all while positioning himself to swoop in and take control of the company when everything collapsed. Brandon's mind raced. He could feel the anger, the betrayal, burning in his chest, but beneath it was something far worse: fear. Fear that Simon wasn't the only one responsible, fear that his father, Charles Cole, had known all along. That somehow, this was all a test Brandon had failed miserably. He had to confront Simon. He had to get to the truth. But what terrified him most was the possibility that even if he exposed Simon, the damage might already be done. Would his father believe him? Would anyone believe him, or would they see him as the reckless, spoiled heir who had driven the company to the brink of ruin? The weight of his failures pressed down on him, suffocating. For the first time in his life, Brandon felt truly powerless. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. The next morning, Brandon walked into the corporate headquarters with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't the party boy, the screw-up everyone whispered about behind his back. Not today. Today, he was the Cole heir, and he was going to prove it. As he entered the boardroom, the usual suspects were already gathered: high-ranking executives, his father, and, of course, Simon Green, standing off to the side with his signature smug expression. The man had always exuded confidence, a cold, calculated arrogance that had unnerved Brandon for years. But today, Simon's composure was the last thing on Brandon's mind. Charles Cole looked up from the head of the table, his icy blue eyes locking onto Brandon. "You're late," he said, his voice as cold and sharp as ever. Brandon ignored the comment and took his seat, his eyes never leaving Simon. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Simon arched an eyebrow, the hint of a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Oh? About what?" Brandon felt the anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control now. Not in front of his father. "About Westbury. About the financial irregularities we've found." The room went quiet. All eyes turned to Simon, who still looked unfazed, his smile not quite disappearing. Charles Cole, however, leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "What irregularities?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharper, more dangerous. Brandon took a deep breath and slid the documents across the table. "Emma and I discovered that Simon has been funneling money out of the company, using Westbury as a cover. He's been manipulating the financial reports to make it look like the hotel is failing when, in reality, it's been deliberately sabotaged." Simon's smile vanished. For the first time, Brandon saw a flicker of something in his eyes: surprise, maybe even fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual mask of calm indifference. "This is ridiculous," Simon said smoothly. "Brandon, you're grasping at straws. Westbury's financial troubles have been well documented. I've been working tirelessly to fix them." "Fix them?" Brandon shot back, his voice rising. "You've been lining your pockets while the company crumbles. I have the proof right here." He gestured to the documents, and for a moment, Simon hesitated. It was the first crack in his carefully constructed facade, and Brandon seized on it. "You thought no one would notice, didn't you? You thought I was too incompetent to figure it out. But you underestimated me." Charles Cole's eyes flicked to Simon, his expression unreadable. "Is this true?" Simon straightened, his face hardening. "Of course not. Brandon's clearly mistaken. These documents, whatever they are either fabricated or misunderstood. He's trying to deflect blame for his own failures." Brandon's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension in the room, the doubt hanging in the air. This was it. This was the moment he had been dreading. If his father didn't believe him now, if the board sided with Simon, it was over. Everything he had worked for, everything Emma had helped him uncover, would mean nothing. But before he could respond, Emma stepped into the room. Her entrance was calm, deliberate, and yet her presence carried weight. She walked directly to the head of the table, standing beside Brandon, and placed another stack of papers in front of Charles Cole. "I found these in Simon's office," she said, her voice steady and composed. "These aren't just financial reports. They're bank transfers. Private ones. Money that's been funneled out of the company and into Simon's personal accounts." The room went still. Brandon held his breath, watching his father's expression shift as he flipped through the papers. Charles's face remained impassive, but his jaw tightened. He glanced up at Simon, who had gone pale. "Explain this," Charles demanded, his voice a low growl. Simon opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he was visibly shaken. I can explain," he stammered, but it was clear to everyone in the room that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. Brandon felt a surge of vindication, but it was mixed with something darker. He had exposed Simon, yes, but the damage had already been done. The company was still teetering on the edge, and even with Simon out of the picture, the road to recovery would be long and uncertain. "Get out," Charles said quietly, his voice dripping with disgust. Simon's eyes flicked around the room, desperate for an ally, but none of the executives met his gaze. With one final look of loathing directed at Brandon, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As the door closed behind Simon, the weight of what had just happened settled over Brandon like a crushing wave. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The company was still in crisis, and now, more than ever, all eyes were on him. Charles leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Brandon. "Well," he said, his voice cold but measured, "I suppose I owe you an apology." Brandon blinked, momentarily stunned. His father had never apologized for anything in his life, at least not to him. The words felt hollow, like a formality rather than a genuine expression of regret. But Charles wasn't done. "That doesn't change the fact that Westbury is still your responsibility. You've exposed Simon, and for that, I'm grateful. But the real work starts now. If you can't save Westbury, this company is going to collapse, regardless of Simon's treachery." Brandon nodded, though the weight of the task ahead made him feel like he was sinking. His father's expectations were as high as ever, but now there was no one else to blame, no one else to hide behind. It was all on him. "I'll fix it," he said, though the words felt like a hollow promise. Charles stood up, his face as impassive as ever. "See that you do." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Brandon and Emma standing in the suffocating silence of the boardroom. As the door closed behind his father, Brandon collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, leaving him drained and hollow. He had done what he needed to do, he had exposed Simon, protected the company, but the weight of what came next felt unbearable. Emma sat down beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "It's not over, but this was a huge step." Brandon looked up at her, the exhaustion evident in his eyes. "What if I can't fix it?" he asked, his voice raw. "What if I fail?" Emma's expression softened. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But you're not alone in this, Brandon. I'm with you. We'll figure it out together." Her words were simple, but they cut through the fog of doubt that had been clouding his mind. For the first time in a long while, Brandon felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't in this fight alone. He reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The following days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and sleepless nights. Brandon and Emma worked side by side, poring over financial reports, meeting with investors, and trying to find a way to salvage the Westbury Hotel. The situation was dire, but slowly, they began to see a path forward. It wasn't easy. The board was skeptical, the investors were nervous, and the staff at Westbury were demoralized. But with Emma's steady hand and Brandon's newfound determination, they began to turn things around. They restructured the hotel's management, implemented cost-saving measures, and launched an aggressive marketing campaign to draw in new guests. It was a gamble, one that could still fail, but it was a gamble they had to take. As the weeks went by, Brandon found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. The pressure was still there, but instead of running from it, he faced it head-on. He stopped hiding behind his father's name and started making decisions for himself. He learned to listen to Emma, to trust her judgment, and together, they began to rebuild not just the Westbury Hotel, but their relationship as well. But just as things were starting to improve, Mark Sullivan returned, and this time, he wasn't offering a deal. He was making a threat. Mark had heard about Simon's downfall and saw an opportunity to strike. He made it clear that if Westbury didn't fall into his hands, he would launch a public smear campaign, using the media to destroy the Cole family's reputation. He had connections, influence, and money, and he was prepared to use all of it. Brandon and Emma were faced with an impossible choice: sell Westbury to Mark and protect the company's public image, or risk everything by going head-to-head with a man who had nothing to lose. It was a moment of reckoning for Brandon. He had spent his entire life running from responsibility, avoiding conflict, and hiding behind his father's wealth. But now, with everything on the line, he realized he couldn't run anymore. "I'm not selling," Brandon said, his voice steady. "We'll fight this. We'll fight him." Emma stood beside him, her expression resolute. Together. The boardroom was silent, filled with the muted tension of anticipation. Brandon Cole stood at the head of the table, his father watching from the opposite end. Around them, the high-ranking executives of Cole Enterprises waited, their eyes shifting between father and son. This was the moment of reckoning, the final meeting where the fate of the Westbury Hotel, and by extension the Cole Empire, would be decided. Brandon's hands rested on the smooth surface of the table, his posture calm and composed. It was a stark contrast to the man he had been just months earlier. Gone was the reckless, entitled heir who lived off his father's name and wealth. In his place stood someone who had been tested, beaten down, and remade by the pressures of responsibility and the crucible of failure. Brandon had come full circle, but the person he was now had earned his place at this table through sheer determination and hard work. He looked across at his father, Charles Cole, who remained inscrutable, his face unreadable as always. There was no approval in those cold blue eyes, but for once, Brandon didn't need it. He wasn't here to seek validation from his father. He was here to prove something to himself. The silence stretched for a moment longer before Brandon spoke. "As you all know, we've been through a difficult few months," he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had happened. Westbury was on the brink of collapse. Investors were pulling out, and the media was circling like vultures. For a long time, it looked like we wouldn't be able to save it. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, no doubt remembering the grim reports from those dark days. But Brandon continued, undeterred. "But we didn't give up. We restructured, we made hard decisions, and with the support of our team, especially Emma Reed, we've started to turn things around. Westbury isn't just surviving now, it's on a path to recovery." There was a murmur of approval from some of the executives, but Brandon barely noticed. He kept his focus on his father, knowing that this was the true test. Charles had never believed in him, had never thought he was capable of running the family business. And for years, Brandon had lived down to those expectations, proving his father right at every turn. But now, standing here, after everything that had happened, Brandon knew he wasn't the same man he used to be. "We've secured new investors, and we've repositioned Westbury as a boutique luxury destination. Bookings are up, and we're seeing a 30% increase in revenue compared to last quarter," he continued. "But more than the numbers, what matters is that we didn't let this company fall. We fought for it, and we're still standing." The room fell silent again as Brandon finished. His words hung in the air, but he didn't need to add anything more. This wasn't just a report on the company's progress, it was a statement of how far he had come, how much he had changed. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Then, Charles Cole spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "You've done well," he said, the words almost grudging. "Better than I expected." It wasn't much, it wasn't a glowing endorsement or an admission of pride, but it was enough. For once, Charles wasn't criticizing him, wasn't tearing him down. And for the first time in his life, Brandon didn't need his father's praise. He had learned that his value didn't come from his father's approval, or from the family name. It came from the work he had put in, from the mistakes he had made and learned from, and from the people who had stood by him, like Emma. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe. Later that evening, after the meeting had ended and the board members had dispersed, Brandon stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city skyline. The night was calm, the lights of the city twinkling below him. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of peace. Emma joined him on the balcony, standing quietly beside him. She didn't say anything at first, just let the silence between them speak. In so many ways, she had been the one constant in the storm that had been his life recently. Where others had doubted him, she had believed in him, pushing him when he needed it, and supporting him when he felt ready to break. "I think we did it," she said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet night air. Brandon smiled, a real, genuine smile, something that had been rare for him in the past. "Yeah," he replied, "I think we did." He turned to face her, his expression more serious now. "I couldn't have done it without you, Emma. You were the one who found the evidence against Simon, who helped me keep it together when everything was falling apart." Emma shrugged lightly, though her eyes were warm. "You did the hard part, Brandon. You made the choice to fight for the company, to take responsibility. That's what matters." For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything they had been through settling around them. But there was something different now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. The tension between them, the distance that had once defined their relationship, was gone. In its place was something new, something stronger. Brandon reached out and took her hand. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. They had started this journey as strangers, forced into a marriage for the sake of convenience and necessity. But somewhere along the way, through the chaos and the challenges, they had found something real. "I don't know what happens next," Brandon said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. "But I know I want to figure it out with you." Emma's smile was soft, but there was a strength in her eyes that told him she felt the same. "We'll figure it out together," she said, squeezing his hand gently. The next day, Brandon stood outside his father's office, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. This was the last thing he needed to do before he could truly move forward. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Charles called him in. His father was sitting behind his massive oak desk, reviewing paperwork, but he looked up as Brandon entered. There was no trace of the usual coldness in his expression, just a quiet curiosity. "Something on your mind?" Charles asked, his voice neutral. Brandon took a deep breath, stepping forward. "I wanted to let you know that I'm not going to rely on the Cole name anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I'm staying with the company, but from now on, I'm doing things my way." Charles raised an eyebrow, but he didn't interrupt. "I've spent my whole life trying to live up to your expectations," Brandon continued. "And in doing that, I lost sight of what I actually wanted. I always thought that if I worked hard enough, you'd finally see me as more than just the screw-up son. But I realize now that I don't need your approval. I'm proud of what I've done, and I'm ready to build something on my own terms." For a moment, Charles said nothing. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, a contemplative look on his face. "I see," he said quietly. "And I suppose you've earned that right." Brandon nodded, feeling a sense of closure settle over him. This was it, the final step in his transformation. He had confronted his father, taken control of his own future, and finally let go of the need for validation that had driven him for so long. As he turned to leave, his father's voice stopped him. "Brandon," Charles said, his tone softer than Brandon had ever heard it. "You've made me proud. Whether you believe that or not." Brandon paused, then smiled, a small, quiet smile, but one filled with a sense of peace. He didn't need the words, not anymore. But hearing them still mattered. Without another word, he walked out of the office, the door closing softly behind him. Brandon Cole had spent his entire life living in the shadow of his father's empire, but now, he was ready to step into his own light. The journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes and regrets, but it had shaped him into the man he was now, a man who understood the value of hard work, the importance of trust, and the power of love. As he walked out of the building and into the crisp morning air, he felt lighter, freer. This was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one that he would write on his own terms. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't the same man he had been when this all started. He had changed, grown, and finally, found his place in the world. And with Emma by his side, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey of growth, redemption, and second chances. If you connected with Brandon and Emma's story as much as we did, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming, emotion-packed stories. We'd love to hear from you. What did you think of the video? Drop a comment below and let us know your favorite moment or how this story made you feel. We love reading your thoughts and being part of a community that appreciates deep, heartfelt storytelling. And before you go, don't forget to check out the next story waiting for you on screen. We promise it'll be just as exciting and heartwarming. See you in the next chapter.